You on? Hello? Hello, guys. If I could just get everyone to take their seats, we'll close the door up now. Perfect. So first of all, good morning, everyone. My name is Bryce Nankara, and I'm an IT development manager within the AMP's digital IT team. And I'll be your host for this Amplify session, which is Insights from the Edge, which is presented by Genevieve Bell. So a special welcome to visitors to AMP, or if this is your first Amplify as well. Also members of the media, the online community, joining us from all over the world via our live stream. Thank you also to the AMP board members and also the AMP staff for joining us today. So just some quick housekeeping before we get into it. First of all, Amplify is not just a talk fest, it's an innovation festival and also very much a do fest. So there's several opportunities for you to get involved, so please take everyone and do get involved with the online interactions. So we've got a fair bit of things on social media. We've got Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and also internally via the AMP Hub. So just use the hashtag Amplify 2017. We also have Wi-Fi here, which will give you access to the AFR site as well, based on IP address. The network is Amplify, and the password is Amplify 2017. So please jump on and contribute. Just quickly, I think if you're staying on from a session, you know all this, but how the session will run. So when finished, we'd like to have a conversation about what we've just heard. So I encourage you guys all to ask questions of Genevieve and anything you can think of throughout the session. We'll also have a roving microphone to go around as well to capture that. The session is being live streamed to some staff in AMP offices, and you can also submit questions via Zeetings as well. So to get involved in the Zeetings online, head to zeetings.com/amplify2017 in your browser. There's no need to download apps, it's just an online experience, so jump straight on. There'll also be a quick survey at the end where you can share what you learnt from the session. And we'll also start wrapping up at 10 to 12 so we can get out of here by 5 to, and then we can get the next session up and running. I won't take any more of your time. I'll introduce now Genevieve Bell, our speaker. So I was very lucky to be asked to be the speaker buddy for Genevieve. I've of course jumped online and did some research and read all about her, and it took quite a while to get through everything that I read about her and to list down all of her achievements. So I think you all probably are quite familiar with her, but Genevieve's an anthropologist and a senior fellow of Intel, also previously the VP of Intel, and she's currently a professor at the ANU. So without any more ado, I'll bring her up to the stage and we'll have a do. Thank you very much.
Thanks, sir. Yay! Well, it's very exciting to be back at Amplify. I will commit to being a recidivist mostly on this stage, but I think when it was over there. And I don't know about you, but I remember being able to look at the harbour, and I'm sad because I know it's a beautiful day in Sydney outside and we're all trapped in here. I also realise I'm now the last thing between you and lunch. I also know that the good people at Amplify have given me 2 coffees, so you are fairly warned. I'm incredibly excited to be here for lots of reasons. One of them is that I really think it's important that we have these kind of conversations about the future and about what it might mean. I also think, given that I got to listen to both Craigs kick this off, for those of you who weren't here 2 hours ago, both of them made a great deal of talk, and I think appropriately so, about the tension between talking about technology, the future, and human beings. And for me, it's incredibly important that we think about where human beings sit inside these stories, because it's incredibly tempting to talk about technology and to be seduced by the extraordinary sort of promise of the technology and forget that actually we're all going to be there as it unfolds. And so it's kind of hugely important to put ourselves back into that picture. And so I want to do that. There's lots of ways I can describe myself and lots of ways that I ought to be introduced. I think the important pieces, however, at the moment are probably just 3. I am, in fact, an anthropologist by training. So my background is in cultural anthropology. I have a PhD from cultural anthropology from Stanford University. But I'm also the child of an anthropologist, and I grew up on my mother's field sites here in Central Australia and in the 1970s and 1980s, and spent that childhood with Aboriginal people who at that point of time still remembered their country before white fellas and cattle and fences, and still remembered what it was like in a moment that I think is now long past in Australia, but it left me with some pretty indelible lessons about life. It was also possibly the best childhood ever. No shoes, didn't go to school terribly often, don't tell my mum, spoke another language and got to kill things all the time. And I hasten to add, because there's at least one American in the room, I did eat them afterwards. This is not like burgeoning sociopathy, but in fact, a good hunter-gatherer. It's also an incredibly long way from Central Australia to Silicon Valley, where I have spent the last nearly 25 years. I ran away from home, like many Australians did. I ran off to the United States. I did my undergraduate and postgraduate degrees there. And then, in classic Australian fashion, I met a man in a bar. in Palo Alto, and he changed my life. Not in all the usual ways you might expect. He really just asked me one question. He said, "What do you do?" I said, "I'm an anthropologist." He said, "What's that?" I said, "I study people." He said, "Why?" At this point, I probably should have worked out he was an engineer. Mostly, I just realized he was buying my next drink so I could afford to be gracious. We had a whole conversation about what you might do with anthropology and why you would study people. Ultimately, that conversation led to my role at Intel. And I've spent the last 18 years at Intel helping them think about people and about why it is that whilst we build Moore's Law that you heard Ramez talk so wonderfully about, Moore's Law doesn't work if that technology doesn't go in the service of something people use. And so for Intel, for the time I've been there, the job has been about how do you put people back into the story about technological innovation? What are the things we care about? What frustrates us? What delights us? What do we hope for? What are our pain points? And how might all of those things be used to drive the next generation of technology adoption? And that's been basically the best gig ever. When I did that for 18 years, I didn't think it got much better than that until I worked out I could come home. And so as of 3 months ago, I'm now back in Australia. I have joined the Australian National University, where I am a professor of engineering and computer science. They do know I'm an anthropologist, just before any of you wonder just what a fast one I might have pulled there. But Intel didn't want me to go, so now I get to have both jobs. So I get to think about what the future would look like and how you might train the next generation of practitioners and students and thinkers and doers, and also how you think about continuing to shape technology. So at the moment, I get to sit between two of the most interesting conversations you can imagine. It also means that what I wanted to talk about now was the future, and in some ways that unique vantage point I've got to have on it, both having been in Silicon Valley, but also having been hanging around with people while they tried to make all this technology work. My favorite quote about the future is this, and it was nice to hear Ramez talk about science fiction, because this is actually from a science fiction writer. His name is William Gibson, and in 2003 he was interviewed by The Economist magazine for a piece about what the future would look like. And he said to them, "Listen, you can talk about the future all you like, but the reality is the future's already here. It's just unevenly distributed." And that's a really powerful notion, right? And I was thinking about that quote, and I was thinking about the future, and I thought, well, where the hell was I in 2003, and what was I looking at? There's actually a photo from a colleague of mine who's also a social scientist and a researcher, and she and I were trading photos back in 2003, and she won because she sent me this photo from a train platform in Tokyo. Now, what the remarkable thing about that photo is that, well, it could be today. It looks, the fashion hasn't changed much. We've gone around a few more cycles since then. But frankly, everyone's got a device in their hand. Everyone is looking down. It looks like the future, because the future was already there in 2003. So what does that tell you, right? Well, it tells you that if you knew where you were looking, you might, 15 years ago, have seen what today would look like. And you'd start to have a glimpse at what the world was going to be. Now, at the time, we sort of looked at this photo and went, oh, interesting. Those of us who studied mobile activity knew that at this point, everyone on this platform is using Docomo, which was a local location-based service, that in fact, everyone here was already doing location-based shopping, location-based dating, and location-based chat. Well ahead of the curve, frankly. But we could have seen the future had we known what we were looking for. So what if we could do that now? What if standing in 2017 in Sydney, the future was already all around us and we just weren't looking at it clearly? And if we did, what would we see, and what would it tell us about the way the next decade might unfold? Well, my contention is that if we looked at the future that was already here, we'd see two things. One is that there are a litany of really fierce problems that need to be tackled right now before the future will unfold around us, and those problems are incredibly indelible. And the second thing is there are a series of stubborn opportunities that haven't actually been addressed by technologists. And that as human beings, these are both things that we spend our time mired in, but they're also huge opportunities. If you could find a way to solve the problems and approach the opportunities, you might get somewhere interesting. There are 10 for those of you keeping track. So if you've got a notebook in front of you, write the numbers 1 to 10, and we're now going to go through them. Number 1. Turns out, whilst it is tempting to talk about the future as though it were all happening in Silicon Valley, the future is in fact not always in Silicon Valley. And part of what you will see in these next 10 articulations of problems is every quote down here was told to us in an interview or by someone we spoke to. And we talk to people, and people say, well, this isn't the valley, by way of saying, you can tell me all that stuff about the future, that's really nice, but I live right here. And my future, I know there was someone in the room from South Australia. Where were you? Right here. This sign is still in South Australia. This sign is just outside of Loxton, and it suggests, for those of you in the corner, it says, the internet, 1 kilometre. In this picture, the internet is a destination. And whilst it's probably not quite that bad anymore, we do live in a country that is now number 50 in the internet stakes. We are not really on the leaderboard in a useful way. And when we think about what it might mean to imagine a future of connectivity, we don't actually have the underlying infrastructure to make it possible. Now, that problem is reflected in many places in the world. We can talk about an enormous amount of new services, but the reality is a lot of those services don't appear in places where the vast majority of people live. They don't unfold in the ways you might expect. And they aren't always tracking to the articulation of problems in certain places in the world. I don't mean this as a criticism of Silicon Valley. I've had a remarkable career there. But when I look at what venture capitalists are preoccupied with, I sometimes wonder what else they might know if they went somewhere else. Maybe not to Loxton, although it has a nice op shop, and the CWA is excellent there. Nonetheless, there are some other ways of thinking about it, right? But what would it mean to imagine that seamless connectivity and infrastructure is not the reality for most of the planet and isn't necessarily going to be in any quick order? So how do we imagine that? Because, by the way, this has huge consequences for all of the technologies we talk about. You actually need to have a robust telecommunications network to have something like autonomous vehicles work well. They're not actually autonomous in the sense that they are self-contained and move all by themselves. They need networks and data packages and all kinds of things. So how we think about infrastructure, gosh, I know it's boring. Like, it's really not a sexy thing to talk about telecommunications standards and data package rates and throughput and electricity. But all of those things actually are incredibly important to how the future gets delivered. Not sexy, but incredibly important. Second thing we always hear from people, globe over, when they're talking about the technology in their world today is they all lament about the fact that it used to be more simple. And usually what they mean by this is not what you would expect. This is not a, I don't like the internet, I resent my mobile phone. No, this is the, it used to be really simple. When things broke, there was one person I called. I used to have one service provider, and they answered the telephone. I used to have one network operator. I had one person that managed all of my stuff. The reality is, for most consumers now, you live in a world where you have someone who provides your internet, possibly the same person who provides your telephony, but not necessarily. Maybe you have multiple social media platforms that you are present on and continuing to maintain. People now talk about that as their social work, not their social life. And what we hear from people is that there is a myriad of stuff that you are having to manage and that none of it is straightforward and simple. Scale that problem up and start to imagine what it looks like if we were to imagine a world of the Internet of Things. I got into a taxi recently in Amsterdam and the man said to me, "Are you in a hurry?" I thought that was an odd question. And I said, "No, not really." "Why?" And he waved at his dashboard, which I then looked at and realized there were about 5 phones I could see, some kind of like navigation system and a billing system. And he said, "The printer's crashed." And I'm looking around going, "Okay, there's a printer too, excellent." And he said, "And now the whole system's sort of broken." And I said, "What are you going to do?" He said, "Reboot it." And I said, "How are you going to do that?" He said, "I'm going to turn the car off, count to 30 and turn it back on again." Now, there are some of us in the room old enough to remember that is a mechanism that used with early computers. Some of us in the room are old enough, I will put my hand up for this, to remember when it also involved a paperclip. Now imagine how that will scale to something somewhat larger. How are you going to reboot a smart city or a smart home? What does it mean if some of the things inside your smart home are owned by one company, the network is provided by a second, the data is managed somewhere else? When it stops working, who's the service provisioner? Who are the moral equivalents in this universe of the plumbers and electricians? And who is the person that you call? And one of the things we routinely hear from consumers is that this is actually quite complicated. Again, this is not a sexy problem. This is a stubborn problem. There is nothing sexy about talking about what you do when you need to reboot your machinery. But the reality is, all of that is part and parcel of the problem and the challenge too. Third thing we hear from people, and this is an interesting engineering meets human challenge, and I encountered it a great deal in my work at work, was that people used to say, engineers, what we're going to do is give you a seamless view across all of your stuff. So if you're looking at a movie on your laptop, it will now turn up on the screen in your car. It will now move to another place. On the one hand, that seems really convenient. The first time we tested this concept with consumers in focus groups, and we said, we recognize that consumers are really bad at backing things up. It is one of our great flaws as human beings. We do not do good data hygiene practices. We don't back things up as often as we should, and as a result, lose them. We said, we can make that so much easier. You come home, we will just suck all the data off all of your machines, store it locally, and take all the photos and stick them on the nearest big screen. Wouldn't that be great? And there was this kind of moment in focus groups where people would look at us and go, that sounds like a terrible idea. And when we had teenagers in the focus groups, they would look at us and go, no, absolutely not. You are not taking the photos on my phone and sticking them on the biggest screen in the house. Thank you very much. That will not be happening. We spent a lot of time going, why is that? And then we realized we didn't really want to ask any further about why that might be. But the reality here is that one of the things that we talk a lot about on the technical side is seamless integration. That things will seamlessly work together. Devices will seamlessly network, content will move seamlessly, things will just auto-magically move across boundaries. The reality is, as human beings, we spend a tremendous amount of time policing boundaries in our lives. We actually like to have the seams. Now, I know you're all going, that's not me, really. You could put my photos up on the biggest screen in the house. It's not what I'm talking about. How many people in the room have only one email address? None of you. That's excellent. Why do you think it is that none of you have only one email address? Well, because you have a work email address, you may have a personal email address, you have an email address you give every time you sign up to a service where you hope they will never email you again. You may have a throwaway email address that you use for purposes that I will not discern or put forward on stage. Beyond that, chances are you have a whole lot of other ways that you manage certain kinds of interactions in your life. You don't necessarily wear the same thing at home that you wear to the office. You may change the language you use when you are talking to politicians versus your parents. All of that is maintaining seams, because it turns out human beings are actually quite complicated and we identify in multiple different ways. The notions of it being seamless and everything should be in one place is engineeringly quite difficult to accomplish, but from a human scale actually turns out to be a really bad idea. We spend most of our time resisting it. But how we then think about managing our complicated identities across multiple platforms creates other heartache and challenges. But thinking about the difference here between seamless connectivity and seamful connectivity is the difference between an engineered solution and a human solution. Humans care about the seams, it turns out. Now, of course, by the same token, if you are engaging in that seamful activity, that means you are inevitably going to have a password problem. And everyone in this room has one. Not one password, but a password problem. Some of you have a password problem, maybe that you just have one password, but the reality is passwords continue to be a challenge. We did a study about 2 years ago and found, in the United States at least, that the average punter had 18 different passwords that they were using across multiple sites. Now, frequently that was variations on the word password. And depending on the site, many of you will know, some of that needs to be alphanumeric, some of it needs to be caps, sometimes you need a signal, sometimes you need to have a lowercase letter. There are no good rules about this across multiple things. And there are lots of strategies as humans for how we manage this. This is a colleague of mine who used to keep all of his passwords in a single book. It didn't have the word password written on the outside. That was at least an improvement. But he had it with him wherever he went because he maintained every device in his house. He also had 2 children and a wife. That meant every now and again his kids would call him in America when we were traveling there and say, Dad, what's the Netflix password? And he's like, oh shit, I know I wrote that down somewhere. And he'd be looking for whatever he'd changed it to in order to let them know what the password was. On the one hand, good security because only one point of failure. On the other hand, bad security because A, it was written down, and B, it was one point of failure. When you talk to security people, what they will frequently tell you is human beings are the weakest link in the security chain. Yeah, that's excellent, but there are 7 billion of us on the planet and we're not going anywhere. So working out how to solve the security problem is probably easier than suggesting we are the problem within it. It is also the case that most of our security practices are old and not very good. I'm not going to make you put your hand up, but I'm willing to bet most of you in this room do one of the following things. There is a key to your house somewhere near your house. You share your password to your ATM card with someone else. You have shared your passwords for some service with someone else. or you just use password for all your passwords. If you're doing any of those things, you are part and parcel of a really interesting challenge. But imagine as all of this scales up, right? How do we solve this? It can't just be a matter of saying you should have more passwords that you are keeping, my favorite one still, on your hard drive in a folder called passwords. Also has a certain kind of je ne sais quoi, but lacks safety. So you've got all of those things, right? But now think about all the services, think about what it might mean to have objects in your house. Okay, good to think maybe you use your voice as your password, maybe you use biometrics. Most recent cyber hacking case with the United States government, 1 million sets of fingerprints hacked and stolen. Now, it's one thing to say, we'll give you a new credit card and you can change your passwords. It's a slightly different problem to say, your fingerprints no longer identify you because we don't know if we can trust them. How that scales to a future, a little bit tricky. And of course, then you start moving into a world, again, unevenly distributed, but already here, where we know there are questions. And it's a world not just of devices, but of data and data-driven services. I cannot tell you how many times over the last 12 years I've had a consumer say to me, but I don't understand why this service recommended that to me. Like, what was it that you know about me that made you think I wanted those shoes, or that television show, or that book, or that man? Like, whatever the algorithm is, I have questions about how you came to that decision. And it turns out a world of algorithms that drive our choices, our desires, the content we can consume, the media we have access to. Those algorithms are subtle but ever present. They have all manner of decision-making rendered underneath of them. And for consumers, there is a growing sense of mild anxiety about what the judgment is that is being rendered upon you by those algorithms. 15 years ago, the running joke on the pages of things like the Wall Street Journal was that people's TiVos, if we remember back that far, so I think early sort of smart set-top box technology, the headline in the Wall Street Journal at that point was, "My TiVo thinks I'm gay." That was when that would have been a problematic rendering. Today, you might be grateful. But, there was the TiVo basically saying, why does this person think that? And the judgment was then seen as being, my reputation is complicated here. But thinking about what it means to have a set of algorithms that drive your preferences, your taste, and they're in some ways conscribing the world you live in is actually quite tricky. For the lawyers in the room, there are some really interesting questions about what are the decisions that lurk underneath these. How do we think about ideas of fairness and equity? It is certainly the case in the United States that there are a number of court cases ongoing, mostly driven by the ACLU, but a few other people, to see inside these algorithms to work out what is the decision-making that is rendered in them. And frankly, in Australia, I think there are some questions we might want to ask about what it means to have algorithms from elsewhere coming here, when we actually have a set of cultural values that we care about tremendously around fairness, equity, opportunity, and how those things might or might not be manifested in algorithms from elsewhere is an interesting question to ask. And some of them are banal and benign. Certainly the case in a couple of dating algorithms back in the United States that have found their way elsewhere, that there were pattern matching technologies written inside the algorithms that, for instance, in the case of one quite well-known dating algorithm, would only match women with men who were 3 inches taller than them. Yeah, patterns of desire being written into algorithms that you can't scrutinize. Tough if you like short boys. Next problem, of course, becomes here, what happens with all that data over time? Who stores it? Where's it stored? How's it accessed? How long it is being kept for? And what other data sets may it find itself commingled with that you did not intend? So again, from the United States, where in some ways these conversations might be the future that we want to contend with, one of the largest managed healthcare providers, so a healthcare insurance company in the United States, bought up the credit card data of every single one of their customers. So now your healthcare data is commingled with your credit card data. At a first pass, they said they did it at a high level with data anonymization and proved some things that they thought were kind of amusing, like it turns out there is a direct correlation between flat pack IKEA furniture and emergency room admissions. If you've ever dropped an IKEA bookcase on your head, you know exactly what that's about. And those Allen keys turn out to be dangerous. However, imagine now what it means that your credit card purchasing may determine the provisioning of your healthcare. Imagine what it means about what assumptions are being made about your credit card activity that may drive your level of healthcare provisioning. And imagine what the assumptions are that are getting rendered inside of that. And oh, by the way, at the point that you got that credit card, is that what you imagined that data would do and where it would live? And what does it mean to think about multiple data sets coexisting with one another when that wasn't how you thought they would be used in the first place or what you imagined? Let alone the kinds of things that can be done with that. There's at least one court case and a second one in the works in the United States where someone's Fitbit, so their quantified health tracker, is being used to testify against them. It was subpoenaed as a way of saying, you said you were somewhere, but your data over here, by the way, not owned by you, suggests you were somewhere else. So now you have an object that's on your body all the time, basically being used against you. Now, I think there's an argument that you might want to count that under spousal privilege, but at the moment, that's not how it's being litigated. It is, in fact, being litigated as that is an object that can tell the truth against you. So how long the data is stored, how it is mobilized, who it is used by, are all particularly complicated problems that are difficult to untangle and that worry consumers all the time, because, frankly, they don't know how long that data is being kept for or where else it might end up. And the law hasn't caught up with this, and neither has public policy or regulation. And it's incredibly complicated globally in terms of how this might unfold. In the EU, the regulations that are moving through slowly the process would suggest that citizens own their own data. In the United States, it's mostly owned by the commercial enterprises with whom that data was constituted. In Australia, it's still an open question. And it's unclear against the backdrop of an increasing conflict between ideas about national security and personal data how those things will play out. And then there is the problem that sometimes the data just gets used in ways where, as a human being, you end up going, I don't feel good about that at all. My personal experience with this one involves my bank in America, where I rocked up to my ATM 2 years ago. It wished me a happy birthday. On the one hand, I thought, okay, I guess I knew that because you have my mortgage, and I'm sure you know my birthday, but that's really creepy. It got much creepier 6 months later when I rocked up to the same ATM machine and was greeted across the screen with a sign that said happy anniversary with a picture of roses and a bottle of champagne. And I'm single. And I went, huh. And I thought about it for a bit, and I realized that what they were celebrating was my anniversary with them. Yeah, exactly. And I went, okay, interesting choice about personalization and customization of an experience. Possibly you got too close. And in fact, all I could think of was the word creepy. I was like, okay, that's just kind of gross. And we hear this from consumers all the time, and particularly that word, the word creepy, has in my head become a substitution for the word privacy violation. Is that when people say creepy, what they're really saying is you just got too close. And it's no longer about individual pieces of data. It's not necessarily about age, gender, race, class. It's about how those things get threaded back together again, the reputation and value that's assigned to it, and the proximity that I'm now going to get with that data to you. And for consumers, there's clearly a line. Now, sometimes that's moved. What's interesting in some ways is that if you'd asked those of us who were futurists about this 5 years ago, we would have had an interesting critique about Zuckerberg standing up and saying the privacy genie was out of the bottle and youth didn't care about privacy. I think 5 years later, it's pretty easy to say post-Snowden, Assange, post any number of other events of late, that in fact the privacy genie has gone back into the bottle, dragging her cork behind her and is hoping someone will duct tape it closed. And oh, by the way, that is as true for millennials as it is for the rest of us. Turns out privacy is not yet a done deal. It's an incredibly complicated space, and actually people care about it tremendously, but they care about it circumstantially, contextually, and for different sorts of data under different sorts of circumstances. But it still matters, and the violations of it matter also. But increasingly, those violations are reputational, not just about individual data pieces. And then there's the really interesting unintended consequence of certain kinds of behaviors that were once tacit becoming explicit. Some of my colleagues were doing some work recently looking at smart water meters. So basically, visualizations of the water usage pattern in your house. Again, pretty benign stuff. We were testing it in a place in America that has water problems that those of us from South Australia would recognize, so water was a big deal. And we had installed this with full knowledge of the household owners. We had come back about a month later to talk to them about the water patterning and to see what was going on. So lots of clear, explicit behavior. Researchers in your house, cameras rolling, let's talk about your water. Nothing in this was covert. And in the process of this conversation, two householders married to one another, the conversation goes like this. So, why is the washing machine going all the time? You like your clothes clean every day. Yeah, but why is the washing machine going every day? How do you think your clothes get clean every day? Yeah, but has the washing machine always been going every day? How long have you liked your clothes to be clean every day? Why didn't I know about this? Very good question. And so you can imagine in this household, this will not come as a surprise to some of you, there's a bloke in this household who likes to have clean clothes every day and a wife who's cleaning them every day, and apparently he didn't know she was doing that. The magic cleaning pixie fairies were in the house. But it turns out this smart water meter suddenly made incredibly explicit a set of tacit behaviors inside this home with unintended relational consequences. And this one was in some ways pretty straightforward. He still gets clean clothes every day, washing machine still runs every day. But the reality is, imagine now what happens if a series of behaviors that are tacit become explicit, where there's a different power imbalance, a different set of judgments, where we're used to not knowing things and where the knowing of things is complicated. So a nice other IoT example of this, a little less complicated, involves cows in upstate New York. RFID tags on cows' ears, automatic milking machines. Cows can now milk themselves. For those of you who grew up around milking cow communities, you can imagine this was a great liberation for the farmers and also for the cows, because it turned out once the cows could do this, they milked themselves 5 times a day, not the 2 that were previously being offered. If you've ever lactated, you might understand why being told you could only milk twice a day wasn't a good idea. But for the farmers, they suddenly had this moment of going, shit, cows have desires, and we weren't meeting them. And there was a very uncomfortable moment where this technology made clear something that hadn't been sayable before. But imagine where else that goes, right? What are going to be the other conversations we end up having to have, for better and for worse? Because a set of things that were tacit, not secret, but tacit, suddenly become explicit. And then last, but by all means, no means least, I'm going to pause here and let you read this because this is in fact a joke, not a real thing. But this is a comic imagining what your house would do if your house could talk to you. So you have 15 pairs of underwear left. Would you like to buy some more? Your cat's in the litter box. Microwave's heated lasagna. You've stared at the window. It's raining again. 15 things in your house are broken. You haven't left your house in 5 days. Okay. I mentioned a second ago about reputation. One of the things we started to find with consumers when we talked to them about what it meant to have their objects become smart and autonomous to a degree, and have those objects start talking to other objects. So we were testing semi-autonomous vehicles talking to other vehicles on the road for your safety. The first thing people said to us is, wait, is my car gossiping with other cars on the road about me? You're like, well, kind of, yeah, actually. I mean, no, because what it's doing is sharing information for your further safety. But for everyone, the answer was, I'm being assessed by the technology. And the technology is sharing that assessment with someone else, often another machine, and I don't know how I feel about that. Again, to this notion of it isn't about privacy in the ways we've thought about it, it's about something more complicated and subtle, about what it means to imagine that the technology might be evaluating you and what those evaluations might mean and who might have access to them, and about what it might mean in some ways to have that played back to you. Like, what does it mean to have your house tell you you're really a bit of a sorry sack? Or what would it have to have, your Netflix account tell you you are predictable? Or your Fitbit to tell you you really don't walk enough? In some ways, none of those judgments would surprise us, but we're not used to having them rendered back to us in quite those same specificities. So we can talk about data and data-driven services and algorithms, but we need to remember we are going to be the subjects and objects of those, and it may be more complicated than it appears to live in a world in which they exist. And then last but by no means least, because this is always the inevitable denouement of all conversations about data, is someone says to me, but the robots are going to kill us, right? And you have to kind of take a deep breath there and think about how you're going to answer that question. The reality is today, the most widely available robot platform is the Roomba. So that's the robotic vacuum cleaner. There are 10 million of them running around the world. They have one critical failure, for those of you who are my age. They are much like the first generation of Daleks. They can't do that. So the Roombas cannot go up and down steps. So if the robot apocalypse happens today with robotic vacuum cleaners, we are all safe. So long as you can stand on something, you will be fine. That's, of course, not a really good answer, because this is actually a fear that in some ways ought to be taken more respectfully than that. Of course, as human beings, we worry about the latest technologies in our lives. We, in some ways, have good cause to, technically. We've come through 150 years where every new piece of technology brought with it unintended consequences, and those unintended consequences were frequently not always good. It's also the case that, at least in the West, we have a particular set of stories about what happens when human beings make things come to life that have owned our cultural imagination for at least 200 years. Frankenstein was published 200 years ago next year. But the reason the Frankenstein story worked was that it tapped into much older anxieties that we have in the West about humans making things they shouldn't, i.e. making things come to life. And so we talk about artificial intelligence, we talk about robots, we talk about machine learning. We are skirting around the edges of a particularly strong set of socio-cultural anxieties that need to at least be respected and acknowledged before we work through what the systems of control are that might need to be put in place to make it a world in which we can live. It is, however, also the case that one of the real complexities about this world we're entering, that Ramesh talked a great deal about algorithms and artificial intelligence and machine learning, is that in some ways they challenge the logic of the last 25 to 50 years of Silicon Valley, which was that you built it in beta, threw it out into the world and waited to see how the world used it, and then iteratively built it after that. The reality is, with some of these algorithms, with some of these autonomous pieces of software, in Australia, we might have a better point of view about this story, because in some ways you might argue they're a little bit like the rabbits and the goats and the camels and the cane toads. If you don't play it right, they will go feral, and feral hasn't always been a good look for us here. And there is something that says, what is it going to be to have to rethink the innovation cycle to say certain kinds of technologies probably can't be put out into the wild to be iterated. They may need to be held a little more closely while we scrutinize them and think through what the consequences are going to be. It also means that across multiple companies and multiple other kind of social institutions and legislative bodies, there are now really interesting conversations unfolding about the ethics of technology. At Harvard, at MIT, at Caltech, engineering courses are actually taught in the ethics of machinery because you need to think about it. At Google, as they went through the process of iterating their self-driving car, it became clear a few years in, when they got to that point of thinking about what did you do in the possibility of a crash, like what did you save first? Drivers, pedestrians, property? That those appeared on the surface to be technical decisions, because that was how you wrote the code, but the reality was every single one of those was actually an ethical and a moral and a social decision. And to Google's credit, they reached out to a bunch of different kinds of people, but most prominently philosophers, to ask them about how do you work through what are in fact deeply philosophical questions about the value of human life and about the kind of decisions you might make around these technologies. It's also the case that as citizens, not just consumers here, there are questions we probably want our regulators to be asking about how these systems are deployed, about who regulates them, and under what circumstances, which, given that our regulators aren't always the most technically savvy people in the world, because frankly most of us aren't technically savvy enough to read an algorithm, we have some interesting challenges about how those of us in the room who are technologists offer to help there and solve, in some ways, at least the possibility of how you create the space to have a conversation about what ethics might look like here. In Silicon Valley, where I began this talk and where I want to end it too, people like Elon Musk and Sergey Brin and Larry Page have started a partnership called the AI for Good Partnership, where they are actually starting to actively think about these questions and about what it means to imagine how all of this might unfold, because we're not just in some ways solving technical problems, we're building a world that we all should want to live in. And so 10 things, right? 10 pieces of the future you can already see that are about infrastructure and human desire and regulation and all of those complexities. And frankly, I think in some ways, whilst we can talk about the technical challenges, and they are myriad and many, the biggest and most important challenge and the biggest and most important opportunity is what it's going to mean to be human as all of this unfolds around us. And in every conversation we have about digital transformation, my challenge to myself and in some ways to all of you is to think about how do we make sure that humans are both in that conversation, but are also understood to be the objects and subjects of that conversation. The future won't unfold without us, and I'd like to imagine we got to be agents in that just a little bit more than we sometimes are. So if the future is already here and we can see some of it, that means we have just a little bit of an opportunity to build the next one. So that's where I want to leave it, by saying, what will it mean to be human? Well, we already know that piece, so how do we build the world we want to live in? So with that, I want to say thank you. All right, Bryce promised me you'd all have questions, so you have to ask them.
Thank you very much. Fascinating, and certainly some eye-opening pieces in there as well, and some considerations. So please don't be deterred to share on social media, though. There's some certainly considerations, but I think we'll still continue to share. So I'll open up to the floor now if there's any questions we've got for Genevieve. Yes, in the front.
Thanks for your amazing lecture. It was really fantastic. I have a question around privacy, your point around privacy. So really interesting if you hear that fingerprints get stolen, whereas you always would perceive it's unique, you can't really. What's your take on, all those apps and services that are coming out around, all your passwords in one place, like OnePass, Dashlane, and how they're all called?
Yeah, so the question here about password lockers and about services that are starting to do that. I think one of the challenges with those is that the additional bar on security is fairly high there. Most of the people who are working on that understand that. It is, in some ways no better or no worse than my mate Matt's book of passwords. It just has a slightly higher usage bar. I think in some ways it's a Band-Aid solution, because the reality is passwords remain remarkably complex and remarkably not similar across systems, and I understand why, but in the password space we are effectively back in the 1850s and 1860s when it came to locks. And for those of you who would not know this piece of arcana, and I'm surprised I do, there was something called the Lock Wars of the 1850s and 1860s in the United States and Great Britain, where the progenitors of Yale, Schlubb, and one of the other big lock companies were sponsoring people to come to the world's fairs to hack locks, basically. And so there was a guy in America who was the world's best lock pick. And all these companies would pay him money, basically, to white hat their locks. And it went through this period of time where lock technology evolved from being single barrel to double barrel locks to deadlock. We recognize all this lock technology now. But there was a period of time when everyone had a custom solution. So if you had Yale locks, the keys didn't look anything like the other locks, whereas now we know we can go to a locksmith and you can get keys cut across multiple variants. I think part of the challenge here is that passwords are relatively new in the scheme of things. It may not feel like that to those of us in the room, but you ought to remember most of these services are less than 15 years old. Chances are you put some passwords back in the early days that don't scale anymore. But we're still early in that technology, and it will take a while for it to sort itself out. But I think the challenge there is one that says most of the solutions have favored the technology, not the human. And I think it's an interesting thing to think about how to solve for the human. Some of the first pass solutions I've seen for that have come out of the financial services, where the temptation is to say things like, how do you do multi-factor authentication? So how do we check you through a couple of different domains? One of which has been to suggest that we would use the co-presence of your phone with your credit card as a way of saying that must be you. Now, of course, again, that's a challenge if anyone else ever uses your credit card. And for some people in the room, that is still the case. Maybe not in Australia, maybe we are so much better about this, but in the United States, it's still quite common that multiple other people may have your credit card at various points in time, partners, children, other actors in your life. And so that sort of mechanism doesn't work. So one of the challenges becomes, as you start to want to think about more sophisticated technology solutions, how are you not creating further problems for human beings? Because clearly the current path is to say uppercase, lowercase, alphanumeric, somewhere between 6 to 18 characters, shouldn't be anything that you can remember. Which turns out not to be good advice.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Do you have any more from the floor? One here. Just your name and where you're from as well, if you can.
It's James Lewis from Carney Group Financial Services. A really interesting talk. I'm interested in your perspective as an anthropologist about whether you believe this is actually a unique set of circumstances that we're undergoing now as a society, or whether this is just the current iteration of what we've seen historically, which is societies believing they're at an interesting kind of nexus, whether the world is ending or the world is just beginning. You know, is this actually a unique moment, or is this just us experiencing our moment?
That's a good question. Listen, I think we are in an efflorescence of technology that is not dissimilar to previous moments, where there have been multiple different technological kind of transformations simultaneously. So, you know, Crystal Palace, London, 1850s, you know, you suddenly had a whole series of technologies that came into the kind of the world at once, probably the same at the beginning of the last century, you know, electricity and a bunch of other stuff. I think what's different now is scale and speed. So that, you know, if you think about earlier kind of waves of industrialization, if you want to think about it that way, mechanization, industrialization, electrification, computerization, those tended to have very particular hubs, and they spread very slowly. I mean, it took a tremendous amount of time just in Australia, right, to go from the first experiments with electricity. Points for the person who knows the first town in Australia that was electrified.
Caves.
No, Tamworth, but close. But that's a good answer. No, Tamworth, it turns out. And, you know, that was in the 1880s, and there was a lot of scandal about it. They had a woman mayor, God love her. And they only electrified it 28 days a year because, or 28 days a month, because the other 3 days the moon was bright enough that the electricity couldn't compete, which is sort of sad. And it took from the late 1880s until the 1920s before you saw full electrification of most Australian towns, but you're into the 40s before most Australian homes were electrified. That's a 60-year spread, right? Think about how long it took for Australia to get to 30 million mobile phones and only have 23 million people. The answer was about 14 years. So, distribution moves much more quickly and the speed moves much more quickly. And I think it's happening on a scale that is very different. So that, where electrification had two primary centres, New York and London, and wars about AC/DC that went on for a long time, and mechanisation not dissimilarly, this wave has multiple centres of activity and a global footprint that is kind of extraordinary. I mean, for as much as we can laugh about something like Pokemon Go, it was a really interesting proof point for the ubiquity of the mobile phone platform and of high-speed networks. And whilst it may not be the thing that says AR or VR is coming, what it did say was that it was possible to have an almost simultaneous global trend because that platform, the underlying platform is now there. So in some ways, this moment is not that different than ones that have come before. And there are some things we can learn from mining that history as to what we might anticipate. And, there are things we always should be paying attention to, like, what are the lines of access and how do they map onto pre-existing inequities by gender, race, class, because those things tend to reproduce themselves unless we actively intercede. But the scale of it and the speed, I think, is what feels different. And the way we talk about it is one of the interesting challenges too, right, is that we have a remarkable capacity to erase the histories of most of these technologies so that it feels like either they've always been here and we should have adjusted sooner, or we don't remind ourselves in those conversations that these things are still relatively new and that comparable technologies that felt that way had a sort of an expansive debate. I mean, television's a good example. First TV broadcasting in Australia is 1956. We get to kind of household ubiquity by the 70s. What are we in now? 2017. I'm willing to bet most of us in this room are still part of conversations about how much television is bad, how much television is good. Is too much television a bad thing? Should we put our kids in front of it? And if so, what? Those are the conversations our parents and our grandparents were having too. And that technology is at this point as settled in some ways as it will ever be, and we're still worrying about it. So I think we do ourselves a disservice when we don't remember things like mobile phones are only 20 years old. High-speed internet access doesn't actually exist in Australia yet, and if it does, we'll have a lovely time with it. Sorry, I'm only mildly bitter about that. I've moved to Canberra, and I have ADSL on a good day, and it's been a very strange experience of going back in time. So there's a bit backwards. There's a bit there about how do we give things histories. I think AI is the same thing. It's worthy to remember that artificial intelligence is a thing that we have been debating inside the academic world since 1956, when the term was coined. And that, there were a series of conversations then and 3 winters that followed where the technology was marvelous and then everyone retreated and they did that a couple of times, and that history is useful. So the short answer is yes and no. That should be it. Thank God. Yay. Run the clock
Thank you very
down.
much, Genevieve, again. And
You're very
thank you to
welcome,
all
Bryce.
of you for attending and continue the conversation online. Thank you, everyone.